when we started this journey, Kim and I and the kids and everything, it was a little over a year ago. In fact, it was July 1st when we. It was July 1st when we started this trip back in 2017. And one of the things we were given is we were given some journals. Now, this is not the journal that I was given, but we were given some journals to record things that were going on. And whenever I met with a pastor or a minister or a ministry group, I would record those meetings in my journal. And when things were happening, we would write those things down. And then, just as most of us nowadays, we recorded stuff in, on Facebook. We were posting stuff on Instagram, and is my slide up here? I don't see it. And so we would post stuff on Facebook and Instagram, and I didn't do Twitter and stuff like that. Camry's in charge of those things for me. But there was always something that was being posted, something that was being shared, and just documenting a little bit about where we were and who we are. And I know a lot of you didn't get to follow us that whole year because you didn't have a clue who we were until the very end of our journey. And so I wanted to help you out just a little bit and share some pictures with you that if you were following our journaling and our story as it was going on Facebook, some things you might have missed. This is actually the very first church service that we went to after we left Oklahoma. We left Oklahoma July 1st. We were traveling in the big trailer. It was 4th of July weekend, and they would not let us rent a site like at the state park for one night. They're like, it's a holiday weekend. You got to rent the whole weekend. And I'm like, okay. So our ministry booked us for the whole weekend. We thought, well, we'll camp out here, and when we get there, we'll figure it out. And so we were there over a Sunday, and we pulled into the camp, and they said, church services at the pavilion. So this is a student from Union University comes out to the state park every single day and leads different people every Sunday. But that was our very first service that we had. We traveled from there. We went to some places. We went up, and it was blueberry season in one of the towns we were at. So this was our anniversary. Kim and I went on our anniversary. We thought it'd be fun. Let's go pick blueberries and cherries. And Kim was like, I want to come. Like, it's not your anniversary, but she came with us anyways and ate a lot of blueberries. And we only had to pay for the ones that went in the bucket. So the ones that went in the mouth while we were out there, we didn't have to pay for. So we ate a lot of blueberries and made some blueberry pancakes. We went from there up into Pennsylvania. This is at Gettysburg. This is a 3-story tall tower. And my son, in order to freak his mother out, likes to lean over the edges of stuff and take pictures of himself. He is a bad influence because he got his sister to do it. And we're way down at the bottom because there's no way I'm walking up all of those flights of stairs. And we couldn't stop it. We could only yell at him, stop doing stuff like that. So that's Gettysburg. We went to Maine at some point in time, ate lobster. All right, the only lobster that we've eaten, but we got one lobster, and Cambry held the claw. She didn't eat it, okay? So she just held it. She wasn't going to do anything. So there's lobster. I'm not going to... So that, I don't know if there's a story or explanation, but whenever we go, we went to some amusement parks because that was their reward from their grandparents. And every time we go to one of those little funky shows, they always pick me out of the crowd and have me come up on stage. But all right, so this is a Bible study we did while we were up in Maine. We were doing some leadership training for a church. So this is a leadership team of a church up in Maine, and we were doing some training and leadership with them. This is the senator from Oklahoma. This is James Langford. He actually used to run a youth camp that had tens of thousands of people every summer that would come to his youth camp. He ran for Congress, and nobody knew who he was except for tens of thousands of people that had gone to the youth camp, and he won and then ended up moving from Congress into the Senate. And so we spent some time this summer, and Tate and I got to interview him and spend some time in his office. If you've ever gone to D.C. and tried to get a hold of your senator, I promise you this is not going to happen to most of you. It's very, very hard to get in there. So we had a fun time doing that. This is Kim doing some ministry with some ladies from a Ghanaian church up in Massachusetts. That's Patience in the middle. That's the pastor's wife, and Rosemary on the far side. And she is one of their deaconesses, and we had a blast at their church. Their services last, 3-4 hours. So, once again, I've got some practice at that. So if you want a 3-hour sermon, let me know. We can make that happen. We can get that taken care of. Here's Tate. He's gone to college. So we went to a college. We were doing some college visits. This is the Baptist college they've opened up in Vermont, and so he went to college class, and this was a business class, and they were learning about some business things, and they had to divide M&Ms and find out their percentages. And at the time Tate was a sophomore, he was the only one that knew how to do percentages. None of the college kids did, so they were really glad he was there to solve percentage problems for them. So this is Tate in college. This is Cambry, growing up too much in front of a waterfall. But every time we stop places, if it's beautiful, we have to take pictures, and sometimes they look great. This one looked great, sometimes not so great. Hey, Cambry, I'm putting your picture on here, okay? Is that all right? Yeah. All right, sweet. I didn't ask her. We have lots of Rubik's Cubes around our house. If you've ever come, Tate can solve any Rubik's Cube. If they're completely finished, mess them up. It gives them something to do. All right, he can handle it. It's okay. Don't mess my Rubik's Cubes up. I can't handle it. But this is our stack of Rubik's Cubes. We left Oklahoma City, so we went back for Christmas time to Oklahoma City. And when we left, our friends gathered together and did a send-off for us. And so this is just a small group. There's a big OKC sign. There's a Ferris wheel right behind it. I'm sure you can see it. It was closed the day we went. We don't know why it was closed the day we went. Everybody said, let's meet at the Ferris wheel. We got there, it was closed down. There were no lights, so we actually drove our cars up into the pavilion, and those are our headlights lighting that up. But those are all of our friends. If you want to know who they all are, ask Cambry. She knows who all of them are. We did prayer walking. These are churches across Massachusetts, and one day Kim and I spent a whole day going from church to church to church, just praying for churches. You want to do something good for a pastor, go pray at their church for them, take a picture of it, send it to that pastor and say, I know you weren't there, but I just want you to know I prayed for your church and the ministries that were going on. And so we were prayer walking at just a ton of churches. A lot of different ethnic churches. The Korean church, the bottom right is a Haitian church. The one that's kind of in the middle at the bottom is a Hispanic church. A lot of different ethnic churches that are ministering throughout New England. That's Tate. I don't know what he's doing. He got a balloon. I don't even remember how he got a balloon. But
Anna came and gave us balloon hats one day because
the Brazilian church had done something. They gave balloon hat. All right, so there's Tate. Here is our axle. We lost a tire on our trailer, so that is what was left of our axle, and it completely melted the end of it. So we had to completely replace that axle, and it was right next to this sign: Tony the Drunk is a thief. So if you ever bump into Tony the Drunk, just know, hold on to your wallet because he is a thief. And I had to drive past that sign like 20 times when we were working on the trailer, so just watch out for him. I couldn't find we drove past a truck that had painted on the back of it, like spray paint on the back of the truck, watch out trout. And I don't know what that meant, but I could not find that picture. But they do crazy things in Vermont, all right? Paint their signs, do things like that. We preached and Tate played. This is one of the first places Tate was playing the guitar, and so we were excited about that. We came here and preached, and you all shot fireworks up for us. It was awesome. We knew that it was a good thing because we showed up, like, if you come on Saturday, we'll shoot fireworks, and y'all did. So that was pretty awesome. So that is a genuine Wethersfield firework right there. So you can see that. And then you guys knew this before you brought me in, all right? These pictures were on the web before you guys officially voted on me. So anything beyond this point is your fault, all right? You knew these things beforehand. This is a Bible school we were working at up in Maine. The guy leaning on my shoulder is a college student from Mississippi that was up there doing summer missions. He was up here for 6 weeks doing summer missions. Oddly enough, he's also a funeral director, so his family owns a funeral home, and so he's got his funeral license and all that stuff, so he runs the funeral home, and he's a college student, and he does missions. So look at all the great things you can do and still do missions. And then this was a picture right out there in the lobby when you guys brought us in, and we were super excited. So that's a little bit of our journey this year. There's a lot more. I tried to pull out all the good, embarrassing ones, and so we'll see how that goes. But we're doing a story on Timothy. You know, we've been working with the book of Timothy. We've finished 1 Timothy, and we're getting ready to move into 2 Timothy. And my thought is what if a guy like Timothy and the things that he was doing spent time journaling, took one of these books like we had, and spent time writing down, hey, this is what happened to me today. You know, went through and wrote down, these are the things that I was thinking about as I was experiencing this. how would the life of Timothy be able to lead us and guide us and teach us, give us some wisdom? I could see him doing something like this. Tuesday, July 15th, weirdest day today. All right, he was young, a kid, they always say weird things. All right, weirdest day today. I was taking a break for just a moment when my friend Lidas came running up to me yelling, "The gods have come down to our little town of Lystra. You got to come see." Lol. That's what kids do. I don't know what it means, but they say it. I thought he was joking. But he said, everyone in town's talking about it. There's this guy named Paul, this new guy in town. He's got a funny accent. He's not from around here. And he ran into Eutychus, the beggar with the messed up legs. The one that's always begging in the side of the town. And so Paul called out to him in a loud voice, "Stand up!" And the man jumped to his feet and started walking. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in their local dialect, "These men are gods in human form." Little g with an S at the end. Gods in human form. They decided that Barnabas was the Greek god Zeus and that Paul was Hermes, since he was the chief speaker. Lidos told me to bring something to sacrifice to them so that we could get blessings as well from the gods. And that would have been a pretty amazing day. That would have been something unique to hear that story. Timothy was raised in this town. Timothy was brought up in Lystra. It was in Greek territory, in Greek land, and Timothy's dad was Greek, and from all indications in Scripture, his dad was 100% Greek, worshipped the Greek gods, lived in a town where there was a temple to Zeus that was there. They were people that worshipped in that sort of way, and we know that his mom, maybe his grandmother weren't Greek, but we know that his dad was, and it was how he was raised. When Paul first meets him, he has been raised in the Greek customs, in the Greek culture. And Paul shows up into this town. And he heals a man that's broken. And all the people think, oh my goodness, there's the power. And who do they attribute the power to? They attribute power to the gods that they worship. To Zeus and to Hermes. I could see Timothy continuing his journal as he was writing, but that when he got there, things weren't what he expected. If it was Zeus, if it was Hermes, they would be down there saying, "We are the gods." They brag about who they are. Kim has to teach mythology so many times that we talk about that, about how the gods live with this huge ego that they wanted people to worship them. But when Timothy would have arrived there, the people weren't worshiping him. They were trying as hard as they could. But Paul and Silas were standing there, and they were yelling at the crowds, "We're just men like you." They ripped their shirts off so that people could see that they were just flesh and blood. They started yelling and crying, "Don't worship us. We came here to bring you the good news. We worship the living God, singular, one God, the living God of all creation." And Timothy is hearing that message for the very first time. The message of a God that is the creator of the universe. A God that doesn't have his thumb on the people. A God that isn't trying to smite them and take them down. A God that isn't greedy or jealous or selfish or anything else, but a God that is a God of love. And he's hearing these words from Paul as Paul says, "Don't worship me." But no matter how many times Paul said, "Don't worship me," the people still thought, "It's a test, it's a test, it's a test. Let's get in there." And they were bringing cattle, and they were bringing wreaths, they were bringing things to throw down at their feet. And the more and more he did that, the more and more Paul and Silas would cry out, "Do not worship us." And as that was happening, Paul had this weird attraction with people that hated him. He had been in a town not too far away called Iconium, and in Iconium they had had a ministry there. They had witnessed and they had bore testimony of the good news, and people had come to know Jesus Christ as their Savior. But there were people in the town that were angry at Paul because they felt like he was turning people away from the Jewish religion. And so there was these Hellenist Jews that were angry at Paul. And when they knew that Paul had come to Lystra, they were following him as quickly as they could. And they got to the town and they saw the people trying to worship him, and they heard his message, and they started telling the crowds, don't worship this man, because this man is the deceiver. This man is trying to fool you. This man is trying to put you under. And this whole time, Timothy would have heard these people spouting these stories about how Paul had come to their town and caused problems, and how they were charlatans and probably going to steal their money, and who knows what other kind of lies they made up. And one of them picks up a rock and chunks it at Paul and hits him. And then another picks up a rock and chunks it. And another. And another. And the mob gets angry. And you can imagine Timothy, his mother, his grandmother, who knows, but the people in the town hearing the message of Paul and then watching his people get angrier and angrier. And they throw rocks and rocks and more rocks and more rocks. And they begin to bleed, and he begins to get bruised, and he begins to get hurt. And he can't stand up anymore. He's on the ground, and they throw more rocks and more rocks to the point where he's lying there, motionless. And the guys throwing the rocks are like, he's dead. Get him out of town. And they grab him, and they drag him out of town, and they chunk him. And they walk away laughing, saying, we've killed Paul. They literally thought he was dead. Who knows? Maybe Timothy literally thought he was dead. Maybe other people in that town that would eventually become followers of Christ thought that that was it, that he was dead. Some of his believers and the followers that were with them, surely Silas and the others, wandered out there, and they gathered around him and they prayed for him. And as they prayed for him, I don't know, maybe he really did die and God revived him, which happened many times in the book of Acts. Or maybe he was just so close to death that it took a while for him to recover. But while he was out there, while they prayed for him, he was able to recover, to revive. And they brought him back into the town the next day. And the Christians that were there said, you can't stay here. You need to go. And they sent him off. Can you imagine that journal entry that Timothy would have been talking about? His very first encounter. That powerful first impression that he would have had about the gospel. Today, as we look at the life of Timothy, what we want to look at is the people that poured into Timothy's life. The people that he would have written about. And surely one of the first people he would have written about is, I saw this guy, Paul, who could have just shut his mouth and he would have been able to walk out of this town his own free will. But he was so passionate about what he believed in that he was willing to be stoned, maybe even killed, just so he could tell people about this gospel message. That's a tough way to do it. Now, I hope that doesn't happen here. You guys, please don't stone me. All right. But I've protected myself. I made myself as heavy as possible so you can't drag me out to the next town. So that's my only defense on that. But can you imagine that first impression? A young man, from all accounts, we don't know that anybody in that town is a Christian yet. You know, Paul is coming in there. He's got his entourage that's traveling, doing mission work with him. But each of these towns, I mean, he's hitting new frontiers. And this is what they get. This is the message that they hear. It's a message that's mixed with this miracle that happened, mixed with the people trying to worship him, mixed with the stoning and the death, and he has to leave town. But we know something must have worked. We know something big must have happened. I can imagine maybe 3 years later, Paul does this mission trip. I'm sure he recovers and does some other things. He often has some physical ailments, Paul does, and he'll brag later about how many times he was stoned and shipwrecked and other things that went on. But I can imagine 3 years later, he actually comes back through Lystra once again. And once again, if we were to look in Timothy's journal, we might see him writing once again, Wednesday, August 3rd. Wanted to share a post from my new friend Luke. You know, somebody says something cool and you want to share what they're saying because if they're cool, man, I'm cool if I can share what they're saying. I want to share a post from my new friend Luke. I made it into his blog about Paul. Read below to see what he said. And so we're going to look at Luke's post. Paul went first to Derbe and then to Lystra, where there was a young disciple named Timothy. So we're 3 years later. Timothy is now called a young disciple. His mother was a Jewish believer, but his father was Greek. Timothy was well thought of by the believers in Lystra and Iconium. So Paul wanted him to join them on their journey. In deference to the Jews of the area, he arranged for Timothy to be circumcised before they left, for everyone knew that his father was a Greek. Then they went from town to town, instructing the believers to follow the decisions made by the apostles and the elders in Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in their faith and grew larger every day. I could see him, posting that post, copying it, pasting it on his Facebook page, saying, "Hey, I'm glad he mentioned me, Mom." Posting Mom so Mom could look up to it. It's like, that's a solid shout out, but what about my grandma? Because she was a believer too. No shout out for Grandma. What's up with that, Luke? All right, sorry, Grandma, he left you out. Not so glad he told everybody about the circumcision thing. All right, that would be kind of embarrassing. You're supposed to ask kids before you post weird stuff like that about them. All right, but, Luke is his own man. He does what he wants to do. I could see that post. So excited that Paul is back in town. This guy that spoke words that he may have for the very first time heard about Jesus Christ. And Paul's back in town. But what's so amazing is Paul's excited to be in that town because he gets to meet with Timothy. Did you see what it said about Timothy? Timothy's a young believer. Probably still in his teens at this time. A young believer, which meant maybe he was 13, 14 when Paul came through town the first time. Maybe he's more like 16, 17, 18 now, as he's gotten a little bit older, but still a young believer. Fresh in his faith, but the church respects him. He's become a valuable member of not just his church in Lystra, but it says the church in Iconium too. There are two different churches that are like, man, we love this guy. How great is that to be a young man and to be respected by the people that are around you, be respected by the churches that are near you. And Timothy is beginning to get a reputation in that church. And when people come into town, when Paul shows up at the church and talks to the leaders that he already knows, the one that he's been corresponding to, they're like, "Paul, this is great, but you got to meet this guy, Timothy." How much energy had that church poured into Timothy? How much time had they spent leading him and guiding him? I don't think it's a small thing to hear about a church that talks about, look at this young man and the example that he is, without having to go back and saying, look at the church that invested time in those young people. Not every church does that. There are some churches that are like, well, we just want to move on with what we're doing, do things the way we're doing. Kids are different. They're weird sometimes. Young people have different traditions, and you know what? Don't blame it on me. All of you that know baby boomers back then, all right, when you all were kids and said, don't trust anybody over 30, all right, it's your fault. You started it, okay? You just pass it down from generation to generation. Every generation wants to make their own mark, and no generation trusts the next generation before them. Which is why it's so remarkable when you get one of those kids in their 20s, even in their early teens, that yes, they're part of that new generation, but they have an understanding about what faith is all about. They have an understanding about what tradition means. They have an understanding about how to reach a lost and dying world, because we need that. We need the wisdom of our elders. But we somehow have to pack it into the youth of today, because we need them to be able to speak in context, but be able to do it with wisdom. And so I feel older and older. We were talking out there just a minute ago. We were talking to Miss Veronica out there, and she was like, Kim's going to Facebook Live the worship service so she can watch it as they're heading to the airport. She's like, how do you do that? I'm like, I don't know. I could do it on my old phone, but we changed phones, the new phone, I can't find the button. I was like, I don't know how to do that. But you can hand it to a kid. In fact, I think Kim went back there to the kids in the back and like, help me out. And they helped him out. How did they know? Did somebody program it into kids? It's the same phone. I'm looking at the same thing they are, but they're like, bleep, 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 bleep. There you go. Why didn't you know that already? I'm like, I used to not be like that. I used to be the young hip guy that told my dad, Dad, yeah, come on. It's like called DOS, okay? We pulled out some, my family, we had the very first Macintosh that ever came out. The box that was like this that started using the 3.5-inch discs, all right? We pulled some of those out in a garage sale at my parents' house 2 years ago. My kids were like, what is that? I'm like, what do you mean, what is that? They're like, is it a camera? And they kept flicking the little metal thing. I was like, no, it's a flash drive. Just really old flash drive. Just trust me, all right? That can hold one paper for you to do for school. That's it. 2 pictures at the most, maybe. But, man, I used to be that guy. I'm not anymore. I'm in my 40s. And I thought 40 wasn't supposed to be that old, but it evidently is old. 1 year ago, I wasn't taking a handful of pills at night. Now, I'm taking a handful of pills. That's how I know I'm getting older. You can count your age by how many pills that you're eating. Add 10 years for every pill, all right? And you'll get there somewhere. And I don't know what happened. But Paul understands that. The people at church understand. They're looking at Timothy and saying, you're young, you have energy, you have this connection with the people around you, and we need you to go. And they invested their time, they invested their energy, they invested their ministry into this young man, Timothy, and it paid off. Because Timothy became the sort of person that was out there doing the work that God has us to do. That's important for us. I mean, when we talk about doing the coffee thing, well, part of the coffee thing is that's how young people talk today. Young people gather around at a coffee place and they drink coffee and they talk, and you know what? We want them doing that where we are. So when they're having a conversation, we can have a conversation. The conversation that will lead them to a relationship with Jesus Christ. But we have to invest in our young generation, our next generation, because whether we like it or not, people our age are stuck in their ways. They're hard to bend. It doesn't mean they won't. Robert was telling us a story, an 80-year-old friend of his that got baptized not too long ago. We saw pictures of it on Facebook. That's great. Praise God. That's hard. We need to reach the next generation. We need to grab them, and here more than anywhere else, reach that next generation. Make an impact. It was great last week at the Cove where there were hundreds and hundreds of us out there. If you missed it, it was a shame. It was a great opportunity for us to worship with so many people. But think about that. We say hundreds and hundreds, but then this was multiple towns getting together, and think about the tens of thousands of people that weren't represented there. And we invited every evangelical church that was in town. So it's not like they were all gathering somewhere else. That was it. That was us. That's the resistance. It's you and me, and we need all hands on deck. We've got to reach that next generation, grab them when they're young, get a hold of them now, and let them know. Timothy would probably keep going on. He had a long life. He's getting older, all right? He met Paul. He's grown and matured, and Paul says, hey, I want you to come with me. And I want you to think, you got this promising young man that Paul is bringing along with him, and I want to imagine the journey that goes on from there. Paul takes him from Lystra, and they begin to minister church to church to church. They start reaching out, trying to get deeper. Paul is aiming to get to Athens, the center of Greek culture. He wants to work there. And so he begins to journey some local towns. He begins to journey to some places. And the first place they get to that we have recorded is he gets to a town called Philippi. Right? We got a whole book about Philippians. That'll be a whole other day when we do a study on Philippi, all right? And it's one you'll probably hear because I love the story of the Philippian story. But they come into that town. The same thing happens. Paul's ministering, and there's a demon-possessed woman that is harassing him, and harassing him, and harassing him. And Paul finally is like, I got enough! And he casts the demon out of that girl. Now, here's the deal. Because she was a crazy, freaky, demon-possessed woman, there were some people that owned her as a slave, and they would use her to be a fortune teller. And she was mysterious and weird. And because she was mysterious and weird, people would pay them money for her to tell fortunes about him or things about him. And when Paul casts this demon out, all of a sudden, boop, she's a normal young lady. She doesn't have those fits. She doesn't have those weird predictions that strangely come true. She doesn't have anything going on. She's a normal, well-adjusted young lady that doesn't want any part of that anymore. And so these guys get mad. They're like, man, she was our cash cow. We owned this woman that would make us tons of money. And so they get the town enraged, and they end up having Paul and Silas arrested and thrown into the deepest dungeons. They're shackled together because, man, these guys must be dangerous people. Super dangerous. They're shackled together in the bottom of this prison. And what do Paul and Silas do? They start a praise service, and they're singing, and they're shouting, and in the middle of the night, praising God, an angel comes and opens all the doors and breaks all the shackles, and everybody could run free, but Paul and Silas convince everybody, look, we're not escaping. They're open just to show the power of God. The jailer's like, oh no, everybody's escaped. And he goes to commit suicide because he knows suicide would be less painful than what the Romans would put him through. And Paul and Silas come out and say, no, none of us left. We're all here. We're waiting for you. We want to tell you about how much God loves you. And the jailer brings Paul to his house, and Paul witnesses to his entire house, and they're all baptized, and the whole town has to apologize because they arrested Paul when they shouldn't have arrested him. And then there's another lady there, it's a wealthy lady named Lydia that accepts Christ, and they begin this wonderful work of God in this town. And Timothy is seeing and watching and walking beside Paul every step of the way, seeing these amazing things. They go to the next town, Thessalonica. And there in Thessalonica, they begin preaching. And guess what? There's more of those people that are like, man, this Paul's going to do to us what he did to the Philippians, and he's going to shut down this real Jewish work that's going on here. And so the people in Thessalonica start attacking Paul, and Paul has to flee and go to the next town. So he goes to Berea. And when he's in Berea, well, that's where we pick up with Timothy. It says that very night, believers sent Paul and Silas to Berea. And when they arrived there, they went to the Jewish synagogue, and the people of Berea were more open-minded than those in Thessalonica, and they listened eagerly to Paul's message. And they searched the Scriptures day after day to see if Paul and Silas were teaching the truth. And as a result, many Jews believed, as did many of the prominent Greek women and men. But when some Jews in Thessalonica learned that Paul was preaching the Word of God in Berea, they went there and stirred up trouble. Then the believers acted at once, sending Paul onto the coast, while Silas and Timothy remained behind. You could see that journal entry, right? Man, Mom, I've seen some struggles. I've seen some amazing things about how Paul was willing to go to jail for the gospel and how God did mighty things, but Paul didn't try to escape his responsibility. He was trusting in God every step of the way. Oh my goodness, I saw how God used that to reach the lost. I saw Paul getting kicked out of this town in Thessalonica, but Mom, the greatest thing while we were there in Berea, Paul was ministering once again. We were seeing people get saved. We were trying to teach them what they needed to know. We were trying to give them that next step. And more people came to kill Paul. And Paul said, I have to leave. But Timothy, I need you to stay and teach these people. What a great day in the life of Timothy. The moment where Paul, the guy that has been pouring into, looks in his eyes and says, today's the day. The day that you are going to stay here. The day that you are going to work with these people. The day that you are going to lift them up. Each and every one of us ought to be always looking. I say this, and it's one of the things I will say again and again and again until God calls me home. We should always be looking for the person that's going to replace us. Paul couldn't do the ministry there in Berea. He couldn't. He physically was incapable because he would be killed and stoned and run out of town. He needed the work to be done there. God was doing something. But what had Paul done? He had trained up a replacement. Was Timothy 100% ready? No. Guess what? You and I will never be 100% ready. It's kind of like the old adage. If you wait till you're 100% ready to have kids, you're never going to have kids, all right? You're never going to be able to save up enough money and do all that other stuff. At some point in time, God just says, it's time. Let's have kids, all right? And you know what? Kids are pretty great. Things work out in the end. But the same thing goes with that ministry. You're never going to find the perfect situation, the most exact time. Sometimes it's just everything else is falling apart, but I've trained you. I've guided you. And you have been built for this time. You have been trained for this time. You've been mentored for this time to replace me in this place. And now instead of there being one Paul ministering in one place, there's now a second guy ministering in a second place. And Paul was able to go to Athens, and he did some amazing ministry in Athens. But while he was ministering in Athens, Timothy was in Berea, ministering and helping and encouraging. He had a purpose that needed to be fulfilled. And Paul finally let that purpose be put into Timothy's hands. If we were going verse by verse in our study of Timothy, we would have ended up today in 2 Timothy chapter 1. And 2 Timothy chapter 1 is probably what we might consider the very last entry that Timothy would have in his journal. It's that last thing that we hear about him before we just kind of move into church history books that tell about what we think happened to him, where he might have ministered, where he might have gone. But in 2 Timothy chapter 1, starting with verse 3, we might find this entry. What I would imagine inside his journal, because if you've ever had journals, sometimes there's important things you just stick in there. Timothy would have received this letter from Paul. And I imagine it's been opened and closed and opened and closed and stuck inside that journal many times. There probably are tear stains on it because Paul actually mentions the tears that Timothy has shared with Paul. Maybe more now than ever because there's a real chance that Timothy and Paul may never meet again. Paul is in prison in Rome. And while there's always that hope that God will deliver him, Paul's getting old. And his health is not well. And he's putting his orders and his affairs together. And we get this passage out of 2 Timothy chapter 1. He says, Timothy, I thank God for you. The God I serve with a clear conscience, just as my ancestors did. Night and day, I constantly remember you in my prayers. I long to see you again. For I remember your tears as we parted, and I will be filled with joy when we are together again. I remember your genuine faith. For you share the faith that first filled your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I know that same faith continues strong in you. This is why I remind you to fan into flames the spiritual gift that God gave you when I laid my hands on you. For God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline. He goes on further in the chapter. So never be ashamed to tell others about our Lord. And don't be ashamed of me either, even though I'm in prison for him. With the strength God gives you, be ready to suffer with me for the sake of the good news. For God saved us and called us to live a holy life. He did this not because we deserved it, but because that was his plan from before the beginning of time, to show us his grace through Christ Jesus. You know, one of the reasons I tell people to journal stuff when they're on their spiritual journey is exactly that reason. Paul is looking back on his life and saying, we are where we are today because we are a part of God's great plan. And I don't know if Paul realized at the very beginning of the journey that his plan would be a litany of sufferings that he would have to experience. But he's passing that on to Timothy. Timothy, there will be suffering. It's a part of the gospel message. Sin has broken the world, and a broken world doesn't die easily. Jesus Christ came and he died on the cross for you and for me. His body had to be broken. His blood had to be shed for you and for me. Because sin does not want to let go of its grip. Its hold on our lives and on our heart. It is powerful. Not more powerful than God, but it is powerful. And because of that, often the people that fight the hardest for the gospel message are partakers in that suffering as well. And Paul's telling Timothy, be strong. Because the faith that I see in you is the faith that was built by your grandmother. It was a faith that was built by your mother. It was a faith that I worked in you. It was a faith that was built up in him through the church that was there with him. It was a faith that was nurtured through so many people, so that at this moment, in this time, Paul is passing the mantle and saying, Timothy, it's your ministry. We keep saying that this is Timothy, his journey of the next apostle. Because somebody else had to be next. You and I have the faith we have because somebody else was next. And Timothy trained somebody else who would be next. And that person trained somebody who passed it along, eventually leading to me. And so the question is, what is our responsibility beyond that? I mean, we live in New England. It's the place where faith entered into this continent. Tate read this week Jonathan Edwards' sermon in school. It's where the Great Awakenings broke out. Where millions of people accepted Christ. But we can go out that door and it would be hard pressed for us to find another God-fearing person. So many people have just let it go, let it go, let it go. And now we live in a part of the country where it's hard to find fellow believers. It's what was so great about last week, to gather with them, but it's so few when we're surrounded by so many. Somewhere, we stop sacrificing to push the gospel. And that means it's been given to us, to you and to me. Just like it was given to Timothy. And you know what? We're not ready. I'm not ready because I'm still learning what it means to be a nutmegger, a connecticuter, whatever the word is. I'm still learning just what it means to be up here, and not for people to look at me as like, wow, yeah, of course, in Oklahoma they do that, but we're here in New England. I'm still learning. And you know what? Some of you may still be learning. Where you're like, you know what? I'm still getting into the Bible. I'm learning stuff that maybe I've not known, and every week I'm learning new things. And that's great. Each of us are at a place where we're growing. And you're going to help me, and I'm going to help you together. But together, we're going to draw a line and say no more. We're going to draw a line and say this is where it is. Today, as we wrap up our service, we're going to share in a time of communion. Because that's really what Paul was passing down to Timothy. Paul said, I had to suffer for the gospel. Timothy, you'll have to suffer. But it ultimately all points back to because Christ suffered. For us to conquer sin, for us to find victory in the lost that are around us, it comes through the sacrifice that Christ paid on that cross. And Jesus invited us to partake in it with him, to remember him, body broken, blood shed,